she got the nickname Cricket because she wore these high-heeled, high-spiked shoes, and when she would be walking, she'd be clicking like a cricket, on the sidewalks.
Well, she was just kind of a happy-go-lucky 17-year-old when I knew her, and just would date about, looked like about whoever came in there, and didn't draw many lines. Well, when you're around waitresses, they're always pretty sharp. They always have a comeback for everything, and she was one of those types.
On Easter Sunday in 1949, 4 teenage boys out hunting rabbits in the desert near Las Cruces, New Mexico, stumbled across the body of 18-year-old Ovida Cricket Coogler. It was a chance discovery which would haunt their lives for years and change the course of history in their state.
Well, at the time the story broke, I never had heard of this young woman, Cricket Coogler. And I had at that time my own teenage daughter and a stepdaughter, 13 and 16. And the thoughts were around this girl who evidently had had a very tragic life. And then when they found her body and disinterred her and brought her to the cemetery and all that, this took more of a personal relationship to me than any story that I ever covered in my life during the 50 years that I have worked as a journalist, because I did sort of equate her circumstances with the circumstances of all young women and what could happen to them if they weren't very lucky.
The city of Las Cruces sits on the southern tip of New Mexico, some 30 miles from El Paso, Texas, and the Mexican border. Las Cruces, remote and isolated a decade before, had in 1949 become an oasis of money and fun.
In the Las Cruces area in 1949, there were a lot of military people coming from the Army bases in El Paso, the Air Force bases there, from the White Sands Proving Ground, which was some 40 miles to the east, and to the south of Las Cruces, right on the Texas-New Mexico line, on the New Mexico side, there were a number of entertainment places, nightclubs, gambling joints. The area was, quote, wide open. In that time, Cricket Coogler knew a lot of these men, these people, and the sheriff, Happy Apodaca, pretty well controlled the politics of Doña Ana County.
The first officer to meet the young rabbit hunters after their report was Deputy Sheriff Roy Sandman, who then summoned A.L. Happy Apodaca, the Doña Ana County Sheriff. On April 18th, the El Paso Herald-Post reported that the spot where the body was found was 12 miles from Las Cruces, near an isolated dirt road leading to the old and abandoned Mesquite Cemetery. The newspaper quoted Sheriff Apodaca as saying that the murder was a vicious sex attack. He said the girl had been slain by a blunt object. Her nose, jaw, and left shoulder were broken. Evidence, he said, showed that she had been raped. She was clad only in a dress with no underwear. There were bruises inside her right thigh. From the time the body was discovered, the murder drew wide media attention, public sympathy, and interest.
How do you explain it? I thought that what really triggered it, maybe, was the casual way in which the body of Cricket Coogler was disposed of. The people who picked her up after she had been killed, dumped her in a little shallow arroyo, and didn't even bother to cover the body properly.
In the days immediately after the body was found, Sheriff Apodaca appeared to do everything a good sheriff should. He brought back a former convict from Oklahoma who had been in Las Cruces at the time Cricket disappeared. He hired an airplane and flew out over the desert to see if a fugitive might be camping out and headed towards Mexico. He rounded up other suspects and reported it all to the newspapers. While Las Cruces was no ordinary little town after World War II, Happy Apodaca was no ordinary little sheriff.
Well, my impression of Happy Apodaca had been formed, of course, when he was elected sheriff. He had been an athlete, and this community is very football conscious, and he had been a football player, and he looked very dashing in his state police uniform, and those were all just the surface impressions that people had of him.
With all his early suspects cleared and released, the Cricket Coogler case might have faded into oblivion had it not been for one small red shoe.
Because right here, this road you turned off to come in here, right down here, about a mile south, man lived down there, I believe his name was Johnson. He lived down there. The next morning, he walked across the road there to get his mail, and he found a brand new, I believe it was red, ladies' pump. Well, he thought that was unusual, but he carried it back, fixed it up, carried it back over, and put it up in his garage. So after so long a time, and Cricket had been found, and all of this was coming out in the paper, and her mother telling how she was dressed that night, only then did he realize that he had her other shoe.
One Saturday night, late, about 12:30, I guess, 12 o'clock, I had a call from a friend of mine informing me that they had found a red shoe, which had belonged to Cricket Coogler's sister, which her sister had loaned her, which she was wearing the night she disappeared. And they had found this shoe down by the side of the road south of town. And when I talked to the sheriff about that, I found his responses very peculiar.
Traditionally, I think the sheriff's department has been kind of a semi-headquarters for the politicians and help their political allies with the muscle and intimidation to get the favors done that these people are asking.
Well, he just brushed me off. That shoe wasn't important, and it just didn't seem to make any difference to him. And I felt that any evidence like that had to be important in a solution of the case, but he said no, it didn't amount to anything, which wasn't, to me, the way a lawman should have acted.
Like the sheriff's department being kind of a courier for the politicians, he was also a chauffeur and a handyman when the bigwigs came to town, in that he was supposed to procure the girls of the night.
I became suspicious of his actions through his interviews that I had with him, working with him, and I knew he was lying to me. Of course, I didn't know what the truth was, but I decided that I had better go down to the Herald Post Office and tell him that they needed to send someone to Las Cruces because this was turning into a major story, and I didn't have the experience and I didn't have the time that I wanted to put in on it.
There was also rumors that there was a party, and all of the parties were backed by gallons of the alcoholics.
So anyway, I told my husband that I thought we should go down. I wanted him to drive with me and witness the conversation. And so we did go to El Paso in the evening, and we talked to Ed Pooley, who was the editor at that time. And he didn't really seem to understand the proportions of this story or how important it was going to be, and he didn't want to do anything about it. But Walt Finley, who was a reporter for the Herald Post, was wandering back and forth through the offices at the time that I was talking to Mr. Pooley. And he came up himself on his day off, which came within, I guess, 3 or 4 days at the time of that interview.
I started investigating the Coogler case. I happened to go into the office. I was a police reporter at the El Paso Herald Post, and it was my day off. And went on down to Las Cruces and talked to some people in the downtown area, and particularly a Lloyd Huffstadler who ran a deluxe cleaning shop. And I told him, what are these rumors about the sheriff? He said, well, I don't know. There's a bunch of rumors been floating around town, and about this girl that was murdered. And he said that he suggested that maybe I would go down to the J.C. Penney Company and talk to Ovita Coogler's mother. I went down and talked to Mrs. Coogler, and she was very reluctant and seemed frightened to say anything. But finally she did say that her daughter had been socially connected with A.L. Happy Apodaca, and he had brought her home on several occasions. And with that was about all the information that I had the first day.
The night of March 31st was the last night Cricket had been seen alive. Cricket's mother later related that she had come home from work and had immediately dressed to go back out for the evening. It appeared that Cricket had expected the evening to be special. She had saved for and bought a new dress and had borrowed a new pair of red shoes from her sister.
Walt Finley's reporting was soon providing more information on the Coogler case than the sheriff's office. Finley learned that Bob Ash, the night manager of the Deluxe Cafe, had seen Cricket in a brief struggle with a man in the street before he carried her to his car.
One of the things that puzzled me, I knew for a fact that certain information had been given to Happy, and he didn't even investigate. And I know on numerous occasions the information that I later obtained had been given to Happy earlier, and he didn't follow up. He didn't investigate.
Finley learned that no formal autopsy had been conducted after the body was found.
The way we used to do them is send them to El Paso if that was necessary. And in the conversation, they said she was an indigent and could not afford to have that done. So I just gave them a description in writing of what I found when I examined the body.
Finley also discovered that a state police cruiser had delivered a bag of lime to the funeral home where Cricket had been taken. A coroner's jury was quickly assembled. Members were shown the body and given a brief description of what Coroner Dan Maddox thought had occurred. They signed the necessary papers, and the body was then covered with lime and the casket sealed.
I asked the mortician at that time if that was standard procedure, and he said no, it certainly was not, but that was what happened in this case.
Steelers again in an I formation, strong to the right side. Here's a reverse to the left. Jerry Nusum gets a block from the outside from L.B. Nichols and Frank Wido. He's at the 15, the 10, the 5, touchdown. And the Steelers against the Giants. Early first quarter, it's scoreless. First and goal from...
On May 7th, the Cricket Coogler murder made national headlines with the announcement that Jerry Nusum, a star running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers, had been arrested in connection with the death. An outstanding and popular athlete, Nusum had played football for New Mexico A&M, later to become New Mexico State University. He had been a first-round draft choice of the Pittsburgh Steelers and had enjoyed a phenomenal rookie season. He had a wife and 2 daughters and what had appeared to be a promising future.
Well, I had played, I had finished at Las Cruces. I didn't get my degree. And after I played 1 year of football, I had saved enough money to go back to college. So in January of 1949, I enrolled at New Mexico A&M then, and was a student when this happened. When I was first arrested.
Nusum had been arrested after two patrons in the Penguin Bar said he was the one who had struggled with cricket in the street. When Sheriff Apodaca wouldn't allow Nusum to be interviewed by reporters, Finley found his own way to get answers.
The way I met Walt Finley was my wife had been talking to Walt out in the hallway, and she brought a list of questions.
There was a pretty long list of questions. It was about everything I could think of to ask him.
With the story appearing in the nation's daily newspapers, Pittsburgh Steelers owner Art Rooney reacted in the style which typified his feelings for his players. Rooney said, "I know Jerry is a good boy. The Steelers will support him in any way we can."
He wrestled around with cricket there in the wee hours of the night and trying to get her in the car to take her with him. They had both been in the bar. And so then that, of course, led the investigation to him because several people had seen it. I did not see it, but several people had seen that.
I had been drinking at the Penguin Bar, and probably about midnight, I walked next door to the Del Rio Bar, and there was 4 or 5 girls in there, and we were joking and cutting up, and I think I might have been playing one of the vending machines there. And I asked if one of the girls wanted to go to another bar with me, and Cricket Coogler indicated that she would go. So I walked out. My car was sitting right in front of the Del Rio Bar. And we walked right outside. We're still laughing and joking and everything, and I picked her up. As at that time, I happened to do that to a lot of acquaintances, either male or female. I'd pick them up and just put them in the car. And she ran back in the cafe. Well, that's the last time I ever saw her. And that's the only interim that I ever saw her was at 15 or 20 minutes.
With Nusum the prime suspect in the murder, Finley uncovered a strange story regarding the Nusum family's landlady. Mrs. Eloise Ellis lived in a home which she had rented the back portion to the Nusums. After Jerry was arrested, she had come forward to report to police officers that she had heard and seen Jerry's boisterous arrival home at midnight on the night Cricket disappeared, a time before 2 city police officers had said they saw her climb into a car near the downtown Del Rio Bar. Now, to Finley, Mrs. Ellis recounted that after having lunch with friends at the Amador Hotel, she had encountered Sheriff Apodaca and some deputies outside the hotel. She said Apodaca had told her to be careful about what she said, that he didn't want to bring back any more dead women.
Well, when I was first arrested and we were trying to prepare a defense, and I'd got out of jail on bond, Mary and I went to see our landlady, our former landlady, and she couldn't have been more cooperative and she couldn't have been more friendly. Well, in the interim time, like 2 or 3 weeks went by, then we went by just to socially call on her, and she came to the door and she was scared to death. And you could tell that she didn't want to see Mary or me.
Thomas Mabry was governor of New Mexico in 1949 and had appointed Hubert Beasley as his state chief of police. With the national attention on New Mexico as a result of Nusum's arrest, Mabry assigned Beasley to the case, apparently with instructions to get it over with in a hurry.
And then Chief Beasley asked me if I was ready to take the truth serum. And I said yes, but my sister lived in Santa Fe, and she worked for a doctor who happened to be our family friend. I think his name was Dr. Larry Doby. It seems like that's the name. But when I said that I would like to have him present during the interview, when I was under the influence of truth serum, all of a sudden they canceled the interview. And then they asked me for the keys to my car. And they took my car out to their garage and they took it apart panel by panel. Door pads, the armrest, just the car. They just stripped the car. The door sill moldings, everything was taken off of that car. And I would wander in from the lobby of the police building there. I'd wander out and I'd be talking to those guys that was taking the car apart. And then they was like 3 or 4 hours, and then finally they said, "We don't want you to go back there and visit those fellas that are working on your car anymore." And I said, "Okay." So then they told me that the Chief Beasley wanted to see me. So I went into the chief's office, and he was sitting behind his desk in a big chair that looked almost like a throne. And there was 20 state police in uniform in there, with his lieutenant of the state police and the lieutenant on the state police on each side. And they had me sitting in a real low chair right in the middle facing all those people. And I was intimidated. Well, Beasley told me, he says, "Jerry, we know you killed that girl. Why did you do it?" Or words to that effect. And I said, "Well, if you know I killed her, you know a lot more than I do, because I'm sure I didn't kill the girl. I can't imagine how this has boomeranged like it has." And he says, "Well, we found a piece of human flesh underneath your car that long." And he says, "What did you do, run over her?" I says, "No." I says, "The last time I saw her she was still in the bar. And I understand that she was seen at as late as 2:30 in the morning." He says, "Well," he says, "you're under arrest. We're going to take you back to Las Cruces."
On May 9th, a headline story in the El Paso Herald-Post, written by Finley, contained a revealing interview. Cricket's mother, Mrs. Ollie Coogler, a widow for several years who worked as a seamstress, had remained silent during the investigation. On this occasion, however, she made the following statement to Finley.
"When I reported my daughter missing to Sheriff Apodaca after searching for her for 2 days, he told me Ovita had run away from home. After I identified a red shoe found by Sid Howard as one she was wearing when she disappeared, the sheriff thought I didn't know what I was talking about. I haven't talked to him since. Even after my daughter's body was found, the sheriff never did talk with me. District Attorney Tommy Campbell never has spoken to me. Neither one has bothered to tell me if any evidence has been uncovered in the case. Several of my friends have told me I'd better be quiet and not push the investigation. But when you have a daughter murdered, you feel like you have to do something."
Finley then interviewed the young rabbit hunters who had found Cricket's body, and learned that when they had taken Sheriff Apodaca to the spot where the body was found, the sheriff had driven off the old cemetery road and circled over tire tracks near where Cricket was found. District Attorney Campbell called it a rumor and scoffed at the report.
Finley's next story altered dramatically the course of the Coogler investigation. He learned that 2 city police officers had seen Cricket enter a dark-colored car about 3 a.m. on the night she disappeared.
2 policemen told me that they saw the Cricket get into an automobile around 2:30 or 2:40, and they had planned to follow the car, but their car conked out, and they were unable to follow this mysterious car.
The 2 policemen had given their report to Deputy Sheriff T.E. Hinojosa, who had handed it to Sheriff Apodaca. The report had not been made public, even though they stated that the car bore an official New Mexico license plate.
With Jerry Nusum in jail, and with the antics of the law enforcement people, there were questions about the calling of a grand jury, But District Judge W.T. Scoggin announced that the county couldn't afford one.
The fact was that the officials in Doña Ana County, the district judge, the district attorney, were resistant to calling a grand jury. The argument was, as presented to some of them, and I think Walt Finley quoted it in one of his news stories, was that the county couldn't afford to have this grand jury.
Among the more vocal critics were college students from New Mexico A&M, angry about Jerry's arrest and a judge who wouldn't look into it.
The young people at the university were all up in arms about the situation.
That upset some people, some students, some others. And then when Nusum was going to be the fall guy for this murder, that upset them.
There are no records as to which students found it, but a remote New Mexico statute mandated the calling of a grand jury on a petition signed by 75 registered voters.
And because of Jerry, who was very popular out on the college campus, students there, many of whom were veterans and thus 21 years old and able to sign.
The students were incensed and started going from door to door to demand to get Jerry released, and also to investigate corruption in Doña Ana County. It didn't take them very long. There was a lot of people that they wanted to know what was going on too. So there was the signatures was easily obtained for an investigation.
District Judge W.T. Scoggin then issued a call for a grand jury to investigate the slaying of Cricket Coogler.
Brought about by college students and clearly against the wishes of public officials. From the beginning, it was one of the strangest grand juries in judicial history.
Well, it was kind of disbelief. This is something that happens to everybody else and not to me. But after we were assembled and you got to know the various individuals that were along with you, it got down to the specifics of what they wanted us to look into.
Well, it's kind of unusual to get a group of, everybody was different in that. There wasn't any two people, I don't guess, that had the same profession or worked at the same thing. And it's just, when they put you together, it's just like the Army that put you in there, and whether you like it or not, why, you go ahead and work with them.
The first to appear before the grand jury was Jerry Nusum. After telling his story about his rowdy night out, the grand jury quickly concluded that Jerry knew nothing about Cricket's murder.
It was pretty hard to tell. I didn't think Jerry knew anything about it, just from my own personal observation.
Just someone that they were running before us to a red herring, so to speak, to get us off the trail. I don't know anything that led to anyone suspecting Jerry Nusum.
On May 10th, Jerry Nusum was released from custody. District Attorney Tommy Campbell issued a widely published statement which read in part, Jerry Nusum has been released from custody this date, 1 p.m. With the statement of Jerry Nusum checked in detail, it is felt by this office that there is insufficient evidence to longer hold Jerry Nusum in connection with the death or murder of Ovida Coogler.
He announced at a press conference that I was exonerated, and I drove back to Clovis, my hometown, that day, and the headlines was Nusum exonerated. And it was a delight to see. And I thought that was the very end of the case and that I would never hear anything more about it.
With Nusum released, the grand jury began calling witnesses it wanted to question and sensed immediately that the dark rumors of a cover-up were true.
It's kind of hard to say just what happened there, but you could feel it. You could tell that somebody was covering up something.
I suppose the first hint we had of a lot of conflict of interest and also conflict of what we were getting in feedback was by the reluctance of just all of the people that we interviewed, or virtually all. The stonewalling of the individuals that came before us, and some where we knew that the testimony that they did give was not accurate, would lead you to know that something was being covered up.
It's just a lot of foolishness. When you take a week or 2 weeks to establish that the body was found in a certain spot, that don't cut it. I'm used to, if you need to get something done, you do it and get it over with.
The grand jury had little to go on other than newspaper accounts about the car which picked up Cricket the last time she was seen alive. Finley's earlier story indicated that the two officers first reported an official state car. They later said they were wrong.
When it came to down to him telling it to the grand jury, his memory had failed him. He didn't remember it.
That, I think, was the start of when we knew that we just couldn't give up because we were hitting a brick wall, so to speak.
One former lawman, Bob Jokums, who had been recruited for the hasty coroner's jury when Cricket was found, was willing to tell the grand jury what he knew. He said that Cricket had battled the man who killed her and had scratched him. He said there was skin wedged under her fingernails, but that none of the skin had been taken for analysis.
I'm sure that the rape occurred. It appeared from examination that she was, the pelvis was fractured also.
Something happened out there in the desert, something that someone or someones didn't want her coming back into town and telling.
The way we used to do them is send them to El Paso if that was necessary. And in the conversation, they said she was an indigent and could not afford to have that done. So I just gave them a description in writing of what I found when I examined the body. The cause of death, apparently to me, was that she had been run over by a car, maybe more than one time.
On the chance that some piece of evidence might have been buried with Cricket, the body was exhumed and examined by Dr. Leland Evans, who said that Lyme had obscured any possibility of further examination. The body was returned to its grave. Shortly thereafter, a state automobile matching the description of the vehicle Cricket was seen entering when she disappeared was destroyed by fire in Roswell, New Mexico. Officials said the cause of the blaze could not be determined.
When we realized that we were being stonewalled, I think the consensus of the jurors was that we became frustrated and then became mad, angry, and that the determined effort by the concerted group was to keep on and dig, dig, dig.
Sympathy and interest surrounding Cricket Coogler's tragic death and its aftermath had grown to the offering of a reward for information leading to the arrest of her murderer. From private citizens, the reward soared from $500 to $5,000. The approach of the maverick grand jury may have prompted what occurred next. Walt Finley discovered that State Police Chief Beasley, along with Sheriff Apodaca and Deputy Sandman, had taken a black prisoner out into the desert and tortured him in an effort to get a confession to the murder. Wesley Eugene Byrd came home from World War II an honorably discharged veteran. He joined other veterans anxious to get back to jobs and families and get on with their lives. His experience would again catapult the Coogler murder into the national media.
So I went down to the bus station that day. I wanted to see how the story looked. And a waitress at the Tortugas Cafe, which was inside the bus station, said, "You know, that fellow over there, that black fellow over there, he might know something about this case." So I went over and sat down and started talking with him, and he seemed to be frightened too, and really didn't seem to want to say anything. And we just kept drinking coffee, and I told him how long I'd been there investigating these things, and he said, "Well," said, "I have a story to tell." And he told me the story of being taken out in the desert by a group of law enforcement officials, including state police chief Hubert Beasley, A.L. Happy Apodaca, and an investigator, district attorney investigator by Roy Sandman, and two other highway patrolmen. And they told him that they was going to kill me if I didn't confess that I murdered Cricket Coogler. It was a hot day, and I just had all the torture that I could take, he said. And so I just sat down in the sand and said, well, you go ahead and kill me, but I didn't kill that girl.
He was one who just couldn't be coerced into admitting anything, even though they put clamps on his testicles, which must have been very painful, and took him to the edge of the grave, as I understand it, and told him he had to confess, but I understand that he didn't do it.
Well, Beasley, I think was well thought of all around. And he had some difficulties with one of his state police captains, but that was no reflection on him. And later on, with myself and some of the other men I worked with, we were in shock of what later took place, because we didn't believe that of him.
One of the problems Chief Beasley had with his men was that he had called in officers I.E. Salazar and Carlos Salas. When the two officers saw that Byrd was to be tortured, they refused to participate. Salas later lost his rank in what the department called a reorganization, and he eventually retired as a patrolman. Interracial marriage was a criminal offense in Texas in 1949, and Byrd's wife was Hispanic. Trouble with the El Paso police led him to move to Las Cruces. Wesley Byrd had served in Europe during the war with the all-black 92nd Division. His friend Cedric and Murtis Bradford, who assisted him through his ordeal, told the media that the chief and the sheriff had picked the wrong man to extort a confession. Wesley Byrd did appear before the grand jury. With his story now public, the grand jury was able to subpoena the officers. Sheriff Apodaca pled the Fifth Amendment to all questions. Chief Beasley, nervous and angry, said they had only been questioning a suspect.
Well, that was the craziest thing to do under the circumstances, where the governor sent the state police chief down to cover this up. If Mabry even knew, I'm not sure Mabry had the authority. I think Mabry was a puppet on strings. I always thought that.
Under Governor Mabry, major state officials were Victor Salazar, who the media referred to as the second-floor governor. Salazar managed the state's finances. Over major industries were Corporation Commissioners Gene Allison, Dan Cedillo, and Ingram 7-Foot Pickett, who had been a Keystone cop in Hollywood before moving to New Mexico, and Lieutenant Governor Joseph Montoya, who presided over the state senate. Sheriff Apodaca, who had been avoiding Finley, then paid him a visit.
I was staying at the Amador Hotel, and he walked in my room and pulled out a pistol and said, I could see that had been drinking, and he said, so and so, I'm going to kill you. And I could see by his eyes that he probably meant it, and I was scared to death. I didn't know what to do, what to say. But finally I says, well, now, Happy, you can kill me. But if you do, I said, Scripps Howard will send in a good reporter. And I could see that it registered just by the eyes. I could see that I'd said the right thing. And he holstered his gun and said, well, you get out of town by in the morning. Well, I didn't get out of town by the morning.
The grand jury met tremendous amount of intimidation, I guess is the word, and reluctance of these county employees to reply because they knew that the sheriff's department was looking down their throat and that any adverse reply that they might make would threaten their livelihood and possibly their meal ticket. Consequently, we ran into a brick wall as far as getting good and valid answers for a long time.
And if somebody said, well, somebody made a threat that they was going to get even with some of the grand jury bunch, why, that goes around in the group. And I imagine they all feel the same way. They take a little precaution. There was just fear. There was fear. You could feel it walking down the street.
One interesting thing happened. I went to Ruidoso to visit my parents. And one of Mother's tenants came over to pay the rent. And Mother made mention that my husband was on the grand jury and he moved out that night.
With intimidated witnesses, continuing rumors of involvement by public officials, and a tight control over subpoenas, what happened next had never occurred in American judicial history. The grand jury fired its district judge and district attorney and hired its own lawyers.
Well, the foreman of the jury decided we'd better have our own attorneys. So we hired 2 attorneys, and that's where the thing really got started.
And Tommy Camel was district attorney, and I'm sure that he was harboring some very uncomfortable feelings, and he just couldn't prosecute the cases. His tongue would get twisted, and so finally, in disgust, he was taken out, and they brought in Byron Darden and LaFell Oman.
The district judge was under investigation. The grand jury didn't trust the district attorney. In fact, they ordered him to stay out of the grand jury room.
Yeah, I remember, again, I wasn't here when it happened, but being immensely impressed that these common citizens had seized control of the machinery and canned the powerful figures who normally run grand juries and control them, the judge and the DA. That really impressed me.
The attorneys hired by the grand jury were Byron Darden and LaFell Oman. Both were young at the time, fearless and aware of the enormous pressures to stifle the grand jury's investigation. With common knowledge of illegal gambling in the state and frustrated with lack of progress in the Coogler murder, the grand jury took a shot in the dark and subpoenaed Sheriff Apodaca's bank records.
The bank account itself was almost an indictment against the sheriff because his salary from the beginning of the year and the bank account showed his salary deposits. Also, it showed a lot and numerous lump sums that were multiples of his salary.
We had started investigating. There was 3 notorious gambling clubs in Anapra, New Mexico, that was patronized primarily by the military personnel, and they had been some homes lost, and the wires had come to see Ed Pooley, the editor, about couldn't we do something about closing these gambling joints in near Anapra.
We had no way of knowing where the money went that Happy received in his bank statement, other than that he was receiving many, many times his own salary, and it had to be a payoff, or we felt it had to be a payoff.
But there was money being passed and is being received in Santa Fe.
In the euphoric years after World War II, New Mexicans had been largely tolerant of the spreading illegal gambling. State archives contain letters from Governor Mabry to the residents who did complain. The governor explained that he thought it was a matter to be addressed by individual counties.
Mabry was a smiling, good-natured, cordial, sophisticated, happy face, and I, in my opinion, had absolutely nothing much to do with the government he was a facade. You know, he came from a prominent, well-respected family, and they elected him governor, and the deal was that Mabry would behave himself and smile a lot and say the right things at press conferences. I don't think Mabry knew what was going on. I mean, he probably knew what was going on, but I don't think he made any decisions. I think the decisions were made by the guys who were really running the party. That seemed to be the conventional wisdom around Santa Fe.
Frustrated with the stream of frightened and silent witnesses, the grand jury decided to shut down the illegal gambling clubs in nearby Anapra, and in doing so, learned that both the state police and public officials in Santa Fe were involved.
Well, several times they had planned raids, and they'd have some of the state police come down from Santa Fe. Well, by the time they got down here, everything was all cleaned up, and they were running church in there where they held the gambling.
New Mexico at this time had wide open gambling, and it was a one-party state. Gambling was everywhere.
My understanding is that Victor was the big collections man for Governor Mabry for political purposes. And at that time, it was rampant in the state. The slot machines were in all the service clubs in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and all over, because we used to go in there and play them.
Attorneys Ullman and Darden began looking deeper into the gambling and reported to the Albuquerque Journal that the name of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel kept popping up among those they questioned. What the grand jury did next was another first in America. Hiding it from the state police, the grand jurors personally raided the illegal gambling clubs in Anapra to get the evidence they wanted.
When we put a sergeant at arms at the door, one of the police, when anybody come in, they stayed in that courthouse. And no telephone calls, no nothing. Everybody stayed in there until we were ready to go. And then we divided into groups and hit everything all at one time. And that's how we caught all the gambling devices. We went in trucks and we brought all the stuff back and put it on the courthouse lawn.
Calling it Cricket's Revenge, Time magazine covered the grand jury in its national affairs section, noting that the cold sweat of apprehension was on the brows of the state's public officials. In their investigation, LaFell Ullman and Byron Darden had learned that the references to Bugsy Siegel were not incidental, that organized crime figures were in fact moving in on New Mexico. Deeply disturbed, they had a meeting with State Supreme Court Justice C.R. Bryce. Judge Bryce then appointed his friend and fellow Supreme Court Justice James McGee to go to Las Cruces and take over the grand jury. On the day the announcement was made, Judge McGee reported that he had received an anonymous telephone call telling him that if he went to Dona Ana County, he would go home in a casket. Assigning McGee as a replacement judge jumped the constitutional authority of the governor. But Judge Bryce had helped write the state's constitution, and no one stepped forward to dispute him.
I guess any kind of revolution has to have its heroes, and one of the heroes in this case was Justice Bryce and Justice McGee, who was also known as a very dangerous a bird hunter. He was apparently very short-sighted, and anybody who went bird hunting with him was at real risk of being shot. But McGee was a fearless fellow, and he was sent down, everybody, as you know, went down to Dona Ana County, and in effect, we sort of had martial law down there.
On May 24th, 1950, with Judge James McGee presiding, the grand jury indicted Sheriff Happy Apodaca. Indictments included involvement in illegal gambling, permitting gambling, and in reference to the Coogler murder, negligence in the discharge of duties. There were more than 80 indictments of non-public officials for gambling violations. The judge, district attorney, and state police were criticized for not enforcing gambling laws and for their mishandling of the Coogler murder investigation. While wide open illegal gambling in New Mexico had long been ignored, the involvement of public officials and the cover-up in the Coogler murder changed it all. About Governor Mabry, grand jury attorney Byron Darden was quoted in the Albuquerque Journal as declaring,
"I'm not saying Governor Mabry was involved. I'm not saying he wasn't. But the gambling payoffs got right damn close to the governor's office."
Although Bugsy Siegel had earlier been assassinated in California, it would surface that members of the mafia who weren't impressed at the time with the remote little desert town of Las Vegas, Nevada, were making efforts to take over New Mexico and make Santa Fe a gambling capital.
Also, the word was that the Chicago mafia had bought big bunch of good land outside of Santa Fe, and an architect was designing a really big, flossy casino, Las Vegas-style casino. All of a sudden, the mafia has lost interest in New Mexico.
The grand jury said it deeply regretted that the Coogler murder had not been solved, but admitted it had hit a dead end. LaFell Oman, one of the grand jury's attorneys, stated that Cricket had been in the company of high public officials at a party late in the evening on the night she disappeared, but no link could be established to her later death.
Major people in New Mexico wanted this crime solved, but they did not want the guilty party found guilty. They needed a fall guy.
It was a complete cover-up of the grand jury, yes, as far as the grand jury is concerned. There were people that we interviewed that knew who the murderer was.
Well, if you can't, you can't. If they got it covered up enough where you can't get the truth of the matter, why, there isn't anything you can do about it. You can't make anybody tell anything. You can get them under oath, and they still lie to you.
Well, when you have someone who wants to be governor or senator or what have you, and suddenly there's a murder conviction maybe in the offing, that's when people start playing real hardball.
I went back and read the old files, and so much of it was not just, it was libelous. You know, I mean, we knew that Little Joe had checked out a state car and had driven down there and all those things. You could get those in the records. But a lot of stuff you couldn't, you know, you couldn't prove it, so you couldn't print it.
In September, in Silver City, New Mexico, Sheriff Apodaca went on trial for grand jury indictments, represented by attorney Harry Bigby of Santa Fe.
Bigby, I think that he is a classic, or was a classic example of power and influence. Not that power is bad, but power can corrupt if you will let it, and he had the power.
Judge C. Roy Anderson, presiding over the Apodaca trial, dismissed all but 6 counts against Happy. On the remainder of the charges, a hung jury resulted in Judge Anderson declaring a mistrial. Happy Apodaca was reinstated as sheriff on October 6th. Possibly the greatest testament to the courage of the grand jury, despite failure to solve the Coogler murder, was its persistence in the case of Wesley Byrd. FBI files obtained under the Freedom of Information Act disclosed that the grand jury had given its findings to FBI agents in the Las Cruces area, who forwarded the information to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, expecting the matter to end there. Instead, through what many felt was political rancor, Hoover personally ordered a prompt investigation based on the grand jury's findings. There had been no new civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It was one of the first times in America that police officers were prosecuted for violating the civil rights of a black prisoner. Never before in the civil rights movement had a black witness been invited by a grand jury to testify against police officers as a result of a news story. The grand jury knew little about civil rights. All it knew was that an honorably discharged veteran had been terribly mistreated in their hometown. With U.S. Attorney Maurice Sanchez as lead prosecutor, Beasley, Apodaca, and Sandman were found guilty and sentenced to 1 year in prison. The case was the result of the perseverance of the grand jury, which, over a period of 6 months, had battled the entire law enforcement and political structures of the state of New Mexico. The Democratic Party had controlled New Mexico politics since the 1930s. But in 1950, Edwin Meacham, a young Las Cruces attorney and former FBI agent, ran on the Republican ticket for governor on a pledge that he would solve the Cricket Coogler murder.
The conversations that the Republican bigwigs had, and that they felt they could get young Ed elected, and he was clean. There was nothing against him. And I think that this was very definitely a political maneuver to get the Republicans back in power.
Assuming continued political control of the state, with what had been an open approach to gambling, the Democratic Party anointed John Miles as the next governor.
And the next guy was going to be, after Mabry, the next guy was going to be, Miles was going to be governor. And he was going to be, I don't know, Miles might have been a little deeper into it, I don't know. I didn't know him very well. But yeah, it was who was the party in those days? You sure had a bunch of scoundrels in it.
Edwin Meacham defeated Democrat John Miles to become the first Republican governor in New Mexico since 1927. In a strange election, U.S. Senator Dennis Chavez, a Republican until the New Deal era, lent support to Meacham in what many felt was an effort to save the collapsing political system in his home state. There would be questions as to what agreements and arrangements prompted the senator's support.
The guys who had been running the governor's office, the guys who were tied in with the mafia, the guys who were protecting gambling and prostitution, they couldn't stand Chavez. And they considered him a traitor. They considered him as somebody who would rather support Ed Meacham, a Republican, than see them back in power.
Immediately after being elected, Meacham assigned 2 special investigators, State Police Captain A.H. Hathaway and Patrolman Ernest Tuffy Tafoya, to investigate the Coogler murder. Both special investigators, assigned by the governor, had served under former State Police Chief Beasley and continued to serve under State Police Chief Joe Roach, who had been appointed to replace Beasley.
The governor brought a investigative team, 2 men, in here to solve this case. And Cricket was out on the street the night she disappeared, and apparently, let's say after midnight. Now, I didn't see her. Others did, and but these two investigators, my partner and I talked to them when they were fixing to leave town. And they said, we're through. We have established what car hauled Cricket out of town, which would have been morning, had been after midnight. Said, we established the car that hauled Cricket out of town, the last time she was ever seen. But we cannot put a driver in it.
The owner and I of the restaurant where Cricket was working, we were discussing the investigations, and also why we wondered why Ed Meacham had sent the same state police that had investigated this Cricket Coogler case before, that he reappointed them for the investigation again. We couldn't understand why they were being used again when they hadn't produced anything the time before.
Jerry Nusum was the only identifiable person who had been seen with Cricket that night, but nonetheless what happened later shocked everyone.
In April 1951, 90 days after Meacham took office, the story broke across the country that Jerry Nusum, once exonerated, would be brought back to stand trial for the Cricket Coogler murder.
Two plainclothes policemen came in and asked me if I was Jerry Nusum, and I said yes. Of course, they were civilians. I didn't know what they were. And they says, we have a warrant for your arrest as a fugitive from justice. I said, a fugitive? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because I'm not running away. I'm right here. Everybody knows where I am. Then when we got to Clovis, evidently they had tipped someone off in Clovis that we were going to be coming through there. How they did it, I don't know. But some reporters were lined up out on the highway. And then the next, it was 300 miles from Clovis to Las Cruces. And we drove from there to Las Cruces, and there was reporters waiting for us when we arrived at the courthouse.
After being taken to Las Cruces, Nusum posted bond and flew back to Pittsburgh. Through team owner Art Rooney, Nusum conferred with Charles J. Margiotti, former Pennsylvania Attorney General and one of the nation's leading trial attorneys. In a highly unusual move, Governor Meacham bypassed local prosecutors and directed the Attorney General to appoint two Assistant Attorneys General, Walter Cagle and J. Benson Newell, as special prosecutors to try Jerry Nusum.
And when they couldn't get me to stand trial through the local offices, then when Meacham, in the political climate of New Mexico, said that he was going to bring Cricket Coogler's murderer to justice, that he didn't care who it was. It just happened to be me.
For the Las Cruces trial, Nusum was represented by attorneys W.A. Sutherland and Charles Owen. On June 26th, the trial of Jerry Nusum for the murder of Cricket Coogler began in the 3rd District Court under Judge Charles Fowler. The rumors that new evidence would be presented were dispelled, and the prosecution began a rehash of all that had come before. 3 days into the trial, the defense began calling its witnesses. The first was Ruben Flores. Of the two city policemen who saw Cricket enter a car on the night she disappeared, one of them, Vincente Romero, was dead. His partner Flores, who had undergone all the anguish associated with his previous actions and conflicting statements, now took the stand for the defense. Flores testified as follows. The car stopped long enough for her to get in and then took off. We didn't follow the car. We didn't see this car anymore. Sutherland then asked if it was a 1949 sedan like Nusum's. Flores replied, "I'm positive it was not." The next witness, W.C. McBride, a farmer from Socorro, told the following story. He said he had come to Las Cruces on his 50th birthday and first went to a friend's house, then took a taxi to the Airport Inn shortly after 2 a.m. The following is quoted from his story. "I stayed there for 20 or 30 minutes, and then I went to the Gateway Gardens. I got out of my cab at the corner of May and Church Streets about 3 a.m. I knew Cricket Coogler. When I got out of the taxi, she was on Church Street. I saw a car parked on the south side of May Street. I could just see the back of the car." Attorney Sutherland asked, "Did you see the license plate?" McBride answered, "I couldn't exactly make out the numbers, but it was an official New Mexico car. I couldn't see the numbers, but it had 3 figures." Sutherland then asked if McBride had told his story to anyone else. McBride answered, "I talked with Patrolman Tuffy Tafoya and Captain Al Hathaway in February of this year about it, and I told them the same story." He stated that the state police know it, yet they spent $50,000 trying to convict an innocent man.
On Friday, June 29, 1951, Judge Fowler met in a conference with the attorneys for the defense and prosecution, and he issued an instructed verdict of not guilty. He said, "The case before you is closed." So, Nusum was finally irrevocably cleared of any guilt in the Cricket Coogler murder in a trial which never reached the jury.
Following release from prison, to allow them to again hold public office in New Mexico, Hubert Beasley and Happy Apodaca received pardons from President Harry Truman through a request from Senator Chavez. Of the 3 officers serving a year in prison, Roy Sandman, who was present but maintained he had not participated in the torture of Wesley Byrd, received no pardon. As he served his time, he vowed that upon his release, he would solve the Coogler murder. On April 17, 1953, Roy Sandman was found shot in the back of the head. His death was reported to the media as a suicide. Sandman's stepdaughter, Sharon Johnson, was with Sandman on the evening before he died.
The last evening that I saw my stepfather alive, he had taken me down to the First Baptist Church that evening, and I was supposed to get a ride home with some of my friends after the meeting was over. And as we were going down South Miranda, another car pulled us over, and 2 men got out and started talking to my dad through the window, and they said they were from the FBI, and they wanted to meet him down at the warehouse where he worked. That's where he'd been going that evening to do some work, and they were going to follow him down there and meet with him. When I got home that evening, my dad had not returned home, and pretty soon my mother started getting quite panicky about it. She may have called down the police department, I don't know, but I think the police came to our house probably that early the next morning to let us know that they'd found his body at the warehouse and that he'd been shot, and they claimed it was suicide. After the death of my stepfather, somebody's car kept being parked across the street from us on Donna Ana Road, and it was there every day, like they were checking on us, and my mother got quite upset about it, and she decided it wasn't safe for us to stay in Las Cruces anymore, so she decided to move back to Michigan where the relatives were. And so we moved back, I think, just before Thanksgiving in the fall. My daddy Roy had been in the service for 20 years as a criminal investigator. He'd been in 2 concentration camps. He had 3 Bronze Stars and a EAME ribbon, and he was a very moral, upright person. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and very family-oriented, and he just wasn't the type of person that would have thought of committing suicide. I have no, firm evidence about what my daddy Roy might have been trying to uncover, at the time of his death, but I know that he probably would not have returned to Las Cruces to work in that kind of an atmosphere where he'd, all these problems had been if he didn't have something he planned to investigate. And he probably was getting too close to the truth.
Although Sandman's death was reported as a suicide, the official death certificate listed the cause of death as undetermined. After the previous deaths of Deputy Sheriff T.E. Hinojosa and City Patrolman Vicente Romero, Sandman was the third police officer to die, who represented a potential threat to the murderer and those involved in the cover-up.
And there again, there's another one that was dead I think he was dead within about a year. It got kind of scary there. Sandman died, this policeman died.
Following the Nusum trial and Sandman's death, Governor Meacham and Special Prosecutor Walter Kegel said investigation would continue until the murderer of Cricket Coogler was brought to justice. Such was not the case.
For the public officials and law enforcement agencies of New Mexico, the Cricket Coogler case was over.
John Curtis the AP reporter, used to keep the heat on Ed Meacham by every year on the anniversary of the break when they found Cricket's body. He would write a story. The first line would always say, "Who killed Cricket Coogler?" ? That was his lead sentence. He then would remind you that Governor Meacham had campaigned on solving that case. Still unsolved to this day.
Edwin Meacham, who became a senior federal judge in Albuquerque, declined to be interviewed on camera, but agreed to answer in writing questions submitted in writing. About the Coogler murder, he wrote the following.
There was no concerted investigation after Nusum's acquittal. The case was still considered as open. Efforts were made to submit and follow any leads. I do not recall if it was assigned to anyone in particular. I did promise to solve the matter, and I meant it. I did not press Nusum's prosecution. I like to talk about the situation or hear about it, but there are too many things that have to be left unremarked and unsaid that could help complete the story.
Former District Attorney Tommy Campbell declined to be interviewed on camera, but also provided written responses to questions. He wrote the following.
I know of no facts then, and knew of no fact at the time of the discovery of Cricket Coogler's body on the mesa, or subsequent thereto, that would lead me to believe that Sheriff Apodaca made any effort to conceal any facts surrounding the death of Cricket Coogler. I carefully reviewed the evidence against Jerry Nusum to determine if it was sufficient to charge him with murder, and concluded that it was not. Thereafter, the state police and a special prosecutor saw fit to charge and prosecute Jerry Nusum. If there was a conspiracy to protect public officials from prosecution, public officials in relation to the Coogler murder and the gambling activities in Donna Ana County, I was not aware of such facts at the time, and I have not, since then, learned of any facts that would lead me to believe that there was such a conspiracy.
There were people that we interviewed that knew who the murderer was.
You can't make anybody tell anything. You can get them under oath, and they still lie to you.
About the grand jury, El Paso Herald-Post editor Ed Pooley wrote an editorial which stated, in part,
"It was the greatest and most effective influence for civil decency in New Mexico's history. It was composed of men who could not be scared and who cannot be bought."
Other than R.A. Durio and Russell Soper, members of the grand jury were Hal Cox, foreman, a rancher, Henry Melendez, a grocery store operator, Carol Boggs, a merchant, Robert Garcia, a bar owner, Jim Vermillion, a barber, Charles E. Neff, Jr., a motel operator, George Hay, a farm equipment store operator, Parker Davenport, an electric company employee, Edmund O'Cull, a farmer, and Joe E. Jones, a radio technician.
some heavy politicians were involved, and involved to the extent that they did everything possible to cover it up. And frankly, I believe they did a very, very good job.
About Sheriff Happy Apodaca, Joby Benavides, who had watched it all unfold, had the following comment.
I don't think it got into his head. He just promised us he'd settle down, but he never did settle down. But I don't think he committed this murder. However, probably some of his friends did.
So who among Happy's friends possessed the power and motive to commit murder? The flow of gambling money moved from Doña Ana County north to the capital at Santa Fe, and a number of Santa Fe-based state officials were in the area when Cricket Coogler disappeared. Cricket's knowledge of such a gambling ring, combined with sexual advances that resulted in rape, drove someone to commit this murder.
Well, from all the sources I talked to, what was supposed to be a little fun out there that night just turned ugly. Maybe she wanted him to stop. Maybe she threatened him. She knew all those state officials and a lot about the gambling. If she was assaulted or raped, he didn't want her coming back to town and telling stories about it.
The timeless mixture of sex, money, and power silenced Cricket Coogler forever. Yet as much as many of the most powerful in this story wanted it, they could not overcome public outrage over the murder and could not pave the way for gambling in the state, driving a nail in the coffin of the mafia's effort to buy New Mexico.
The public had seemed to be perfectly willing to accept the fact that the chief of police in Santa Fe seemed to be running a whorehouse, that there were illegal slot machines in the bus station about 100 yards from the police station. That didn't bother them as much, or at least maybe they thought it was inevitable. But this strange little murder and the incredible efforts to cover it up caused a kind of outrage that cleaned up New Mexico. I really believe that had the Cricket Coogler case not happened, Santa Fe would be Las Vegas. The mafia was moving in, the gambling casinos would be in, Santa Fe would be a cluster of gigantic Caesar palaces and so forth.
As a result of the Cricket Coogler murder, for one of the first times in America, police officers had been successfully prosecuted for violating the civil rights of a black prisoner. Judicial precedent for the powers and activities of a grand jury led to changes in these statutes in New Mexico and other states. With regard to the New Mexico state officials, other than Gene Allison, who was killed in an automobile accident, a few remained in politics and others retired, and all seemingly lived happily ever after. They rest with peace of mind, knowing that the evidence and official files were taken care of.
When the courthouse, a new courthouse was built in Doña Ana County some years later, all the records of the various grand juries and such were supposedly transferred to the new courthouse, but some way the records of the Cricket Coogler case disappeared. They are gone, nowhere to be found. Former Governor John Sims, who was the New Mexico governor in 1955-56, told me an interesting story one time. When he went into office, his first day in office, he found the office stripped of everything, paper clips, pencils, nothing there, except on the governor's desk, a file. And this file was marked the Cricket Coogler case. And it apparently contained a lot of the allegations and the results of some investigations. And when Governor Sims left office at the end of 1956, he took the file with him, and it was in his private papers. Well, when I ran into Governor Sims one day, in fact, he was late meeting me for a luncheon appointment, he had been down at the bank, the First National Bank in Albuquerque, where his papers were then stored, And in responding to a request from the State Records Center for the papers of his administration, which he had agreed to give them, he had gone down out of a sense of nostalgia or something to look at some of the paperwork. And he said, the first thing I found was this Cricket Coogler file. And he said, my Lord, can you imagine the embarrassment that if this file were ever made public, the embarrassment to certain individuals. That file itself, I understand that Governor Sims never did turn all of his papers over to the Records Center. He put a hold on everything, as he told me he was going to, till he could go through everything. And after Governor Sims's death, I contacted his widow, who's also now deceased, and one of his sons, and to ask about that. I've never been able to find that file, and my guess that one passed into history rather quickly.
Jerry Nusum played 5 seasons for the Pittsburgh Steelers, retiring in 1952. He became a successful businessman and automobile dealer in Pittsburgh until his retirement in 1989. He currently lives in Pittsburgh with his wife, Mary. Walt Finley was nominated for and became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of the Coogler story. He later was a longtime journalist for the Tulsa World and editor of the Big Spring, Texas Herald until his retirement. Wesley Byrd left New Mexico for his home in South Carolina immediately after the convictions of Apodaca, Beasley, and Sandman. He granted interviews for a brief period of time, but died a tragic death from a gunshot accident some 3 years later. A.L. Happy Apodaca later served as a justice of the peace for a period of time. He died in 1981 and is buried in Masonic Cemetery in Las Cruces, near the grave of Cricket Coogler. Hubert Beasley later served several years as chief of police in Tucumcari, New Mexico, until his retirement. He died in 1969. No one could have foreseen the incredible chain of events that resulted from that fateful day when 4 young men discovered Cricket Coogler's body. Those rabbit hunters, Jerry and Glenn Smith, and Jerry and Charlie Hawkins, still reside in New Mexico.